2013 promises to be the most dangerous and disastrous year for consumers all across this country, and especially those consumers here in the state of Florida who are suffering through foreclosure. And it will be such a disastrous year because of you. It's your fault. It's your fault because you're not doing nearly enough to go out there and protest what's happening in your government. You're not doing enough to go out there to support your neighbors and to rail against this government, which is abusing citizens, not just in the state, not just in this country, and all across the world. Now, I'm going to get a little bit off topic here, and I'm going to talk about what's happening in this country right now. We live under a regime with a president who is killing innocent women and children all across this country. Recently, we're getting disclosures about these drone strike programs, but you need to understand especially what's happening in this country. We have a president of the United States of America who has articulated a policy that he could kill innocent citizens all across this world with little or no evidence against them. He has articulated a policy that there is no due process. He has articulated a policy that the United States military can engage in the killing of American citizens, not in the theater of war in countries all across this world, and he's doing it with impunity. Now, I know that's a little bit off topic, but it's just another example of what's happening in this country. And frankly, if we have a president who has articulated a policy that they can kill innocent children and innocent civilians all across this world, including American citizens, then what hope do we have of raising the public's awareness about things which are decidedly less significant, like foreclosure? Now, with that as a backdrop, let's talk about what's happening in the space of the financial crimes that the banks and institutions continue to engage in with impunity, with citizens who won't do anything at all about it. Now, this is Super Bowl week, and millions of Americans turned on to this useless exercise called the Super Bowl. Millions of Americans can cite the teams that were in the Super Bowl, and many of those American citizens can quote statistics of win-loss ratios of one team or the other. They can quote the members that are on those teams. They can quote the head coaches and the players. And yet, not many Americans know more important figures that are far more important to the everyday lives of Americans. People like Lanny Brewer, do you know who that is? Eric Holder, do you know who that is? Timothy Geithner, do you know who that is? Ben Bernanke, do you know who that is? Well, these figures are far more important and far more dangerous and have a far greater impact on the lives of every single American citizen, and yet far too few Americans know anything about who these people are. Make no mistake, these individuals are the ones that are responsible for stealing the treasure of the United States of America. They're reaching into the pockets of me and you and our children and our grandchildren even. They're stealing from all of us, and yet no one is doing anything about it. Now, you may go out and read some article by Matt Taibbi or Susan Smith or any of the other bloggers or writers that are out there who are quite clearly and accurately documenting what is happening. The banking institutions, with the express permission and, in fact, the support of the United States government, are stealing from the United States of America. They're stealing from every single one of us, and no one's doing anything about it. What do I mean when I say they're stealing from every one of us? Well, let's look particularly about the settlements that were reached between the banks and institutions, both at the 49 state AG settlement and then more recently the Office of Comptroller and Currency settlement. Now, the press, who were nothing but propaganda organisms affiliated with the government, regurgitate these headlines which assert that banks and institutions are reaching a $25 billion settlement, or in the OCC settlement a $10 billion or whatever it is settlement. But the press does not dig deeper into what these settlements really mean. And what's so offensive about particularly the 49 state attorney general settlement is within the complaints and the consent judgments, which I encourage everyone to read, it provides the facts right there. These settlements were not about robo-signing. Robo-signing and the forgery and the fraud that was committed in the context of robo-signing and preparing the documents are just a means to the end. The reality is, what the consent judgments detail is that the banks and institutions were permitted to engage in practices which involved in submitting false insurance claims. They were engaging in insurance fraud. And the insurance fraud allowed them to pocket billions of dollars in the cases of Bank of America, GMAC, and Wells, these other banks. It's detailed quite significantly in the Office of Inspector General audit reports, which are released and which are part of these settlement agreements. Those reports detail how when the banks and institutions, using the power of the federal government to originate these loans, were engaging in fraud when they were originating these bad loans. Why were they engaging in fraud, and how were they engaging in fraud? Well, they were underwriting loans and closing loans which didn't meet the specific criteria that was required for them to originate those loans. And the reason they were doing it is because when they originate more and more of those loans, they're able to put more and more money into their pocket and then shift off these bad loans to you and I as taxpayers through their emissaries, the Fannie and Freddie. So when Bank of America originates a bad loan which completely ignores the underwriting criteria, they originate that loan for $100,000, Bank of America does, then they put a few $1,000s into their pocket and then sell that bad loan off to Fannie and Freddie. Well, because it's a government-insured loan, the risk of that loan going bad is now transferred to Fannie and Freddie, and when it goes bad, Bank of America simply makes a claim on Fannie and Freddie for which they are paid. Happens next is that once that loan goes into default or in foreclosure, Bank of America, the institutions, engage in fraud in preparing the documents that are used to ultimately obtain title to that property, either in the foreclosure proceeding or in bankruptcy. But they suffered no consequence for engaging in this faulty document preparation, which ranged from sloppy to reckless to fraud to forgery. But again, they suffered no consequence for that. The banks and institutions were allowed to engage in originating a loan improperly, servicing a loan improperly, foreclosing, engaging in fraud and forgery to prepare that paperwork in the context of that foreclosure, and now ultimately gain title to that property, all the while continuing to suck more and more money out of you and I as taxpayers and the federal government and put it into their balance sheets and in their pockets. None of them have suffered any consequence for doing so, because even the penalties, the light penalties that were assessed by the federal government and the attorneys general in the context of these foreclosures, don't really come out of the bank's balance sheets. They come out of you and I as taxpayers. They come out of those who invested in those banks. But the problem is no one is doing anything about it. No one has screamed loud enough about what a travesty, what treason, in fact, it is. Treason because the banks and institutions have been permitted to steal from taxpayers. They've been permitted to reach into the pocketbook of every single one of us as taxpayers and pocket that money. Well, here in the state of Florida, currently, even this week, the Florida House of Representatives is considering a bill which would dramatically change the landscape in foreclosure. The bill has an express purpose of speeding foreclosures along. And the problem with this is that the federal settlements, both the 49 state AG and the Office of Comptroller and Currency, articulate and document quite clearly the wrongdoing that the banks and institutions were permitted to engage in. Now, in the face of absolute proof that the banks and institutions were engaged in wrongdoing, and now the documentation and the admission of this in the context of these settlements, what our state should be doing, rather than saying, hey, now that we know clearly you were engaged in wrongdoing, and we're just going to forget that and let you get on your way, and in fact, we're going to fund you going on your way in a much quicker manner. Rather than doing that, our state should be using these settlements as the framework to say, you engaged in wrongdoing, you engaged in criminal or just improper conduct. And as a result of that, we're going to hold you accountable. We're not going to reward you by speeding foreclosures along more quickly. No, no, no. We're going to make you stop and slow down and be accountable to the general public that you are defrauding and stealing and robbing from. Our state's not doing that. As part of the 49 state attorney general settlement, what our attorney general and legislators and policymakers have done is to say, as part of the fine that you pay, $5 million, we're going to use that money to speed foreclosures along. We're going to take the money, which was expressly set aside and should have been used to, quote unquote, help consumers. Well, we're using $5 million of that money. We're providing it to the court system. And what the court system is doing with that money is speeding foreclosures along more quickly. Now, I don't think that speeding foreclosures along and rushing a homeowner towards a final judgment of foreclosure that will end up them thrown into the street in any way can be calculated or articulated that helps consumers. And yet that's precisely what's happening here in the state of Florida. Courts are using this $5 million to set up rocket dockets once again, which are going to throw consumers out into the street more quickly. Now, here, even this week, the Florida House Civil Justice Committee is meeting to consider this new legislation, the Florida House Bill 87. This bill is bad for consumers. It will only lead to people being thrown into the street more quickly. It's a backdoor bailout for the banks and the title insurance companies. And yet consumers aren't reaching out to their legislators and screaming bloody murder that this shouldn't happen. They shouldn't be allowed to move this legislation along more quickly. The comments that I hear from our state legislators is we're not hearing from consumers at all. And so in the space of that, what are legislators going to do? They're going to pass this bill along, and our neighbors are going to be thrown into the street more quickly. The 370,000 or so cases that are currently pending that consumers are suffering in right now, they're going to be moved out into the street more quickly, and the banks and institutions are going to be rewarded for their improper conduct. Why? Because consumers are not speaking out. Consumers are not calling their elected representatives and senators and telling them, I'm sick and tired of the banks and institutions getting bailed out on my back. I'm sick and tired as a taxpayer of these institutions robbing us and you as legislators not doing enough about it. Make no mistake, because you as a consumer, you as a voter are not doing enough, the banks are getting away with it. The legislators are going to pass this. This should be a rallying cry to you as a consumer. When bad things are happening right here in front of your face and you're not doing enough, you're not reaching out to legislators and representatives and telling them to stop. You're not reaching out to your courts on a local level and saying, I won't permit rocket dockets to continue. I won't permit this desecration of due process in our court system. Then you are going to suffer the consequences for it. It's time for you to get involved. It's time for you to reach out to legislators and court systems and go into your courts all across this state. Watch what's happening in foreclosure courtrooms and say enough is enough and need to stop. Because if you don't, things are only going to get worse.